Today's episode is not fun. When pregnancy ends because the baby dies, it's about impossible to think through. And yet, if you find yourself in that position, you're going to have a lot of decisions to make. So today, I want to help you have the information that you need to walk through a miscarriage if it ever happens to you. Let's go. Are you a Christian woman yearning for a beautiful, joyful pregnancy and birth with a focus on God, not medical tests? Are you worried the birth you want isn't possible and you're tired of being treated like an accident waiting to happen? Hey Mama, I'm Lori, host of Your Birth God's Way. I'm a certified nurse midwife now, but I wasn't always. After working for nearly 20 years in the broken maternity system, I too was in your shoes wondering how I could have the birth I wanted and that I felt God meant for me to have. I found a secret that has actually been known since the beginning of time. God's way is the best way. Spoiler alert, God made us and our babies, and He knows us best. He designed us perfectly for pregnancy, birth, and nourishing our babies after birth, if we work with His design and not against it. In this podcast, you'll learn how to be healthy and have joy during this time of life that will be over before you know it. So if you're ready to reclaim your birth and your babies for His glory, go turn on a few episodes of Bluey for that little one on your hip so you can put the focus back on you for a few minutes with me. Real quick review time. Even though this episode is a little tough one, I still want to thank you guys who have taken the time to leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. Today's review comes from It's Lex from back in January. The title is Cast Fear Aside. I have been scavenging through podcasts relating to pregnancy / postpartum / breastfeeding, as this is my first pregnancy and I want to be informed. First off, I love that it's a Christ-centered podcast. Her background from being on both sides, medical field and midwife field, really gives her great insight and unique perspective. I have learned a lot from this podcast and have been binging this show for the last few weeks now. It is wonderful to be reassured that you are in control of your birth. Even in a hospital setting, you can still have a birth plan. I will be recommending this show to all the pregnant mamas I know. Thank you, Lori, for stepping up and out to help support other women and their husbands during a journey that changes so fast but is so precious. Keep going. Thank you so much, Lex, for those sweet, sweet words of encouragement. You encompassed everything that I am here to do. I am here to encourage you and to give you the tools that you need to make good decisions. So thank you for encouraging me, and thank you for sharing the show with other mamas. That's the best thank you you can give me beyond this really nice thank you gave me here. If you are a mama who has not left me a review yet, please take a couple of seconds, go over to Apple Podcasts, leave me a quick 5-star written review. Helps me so much, encourages me just like Lex did here, and also helps me to find other mamas like you who can benefit from this information. It's very hard as a Christian, as I'm sure you know, to find good information that's also faith-based. And lots of people are out there looking and they just don't know where to find it. And many of you found me just by stumbling upon me, maybe because you were in Apple Podcasts and you typed something in and it made my podcast pop up. Well, guess what? The reason I popped up is because of all of the moms who have taken the time to leave a review. That is why Apple Podcast shows me to people. And that is why I need you to keep leaving reviews so that all these mamas who aren't even pregnant yet will be able to find me when their time comes. Okay, off that soapbox. Today's topic is hard. It's very hard, whether you're a Christian or not. It's hard to think through, why do we lose babies? It's hard to think through why we have to go through such hard things. We know God is in control, and yet it doesn't make it hurt any less. And so it can be tough making the decisions that you have to make if you find out that you've had a miscarriage. So I'm going to try to help you understand the options and what they're going to walk you through if this were to happen to you, so that when it does, you have this resource and you don't have to walk through it alone. An early miscarriage is one that happens obviously early in your pregnancy, usually in the first trimester. It's long before baby can survive outside the womb, so that's, not an option. Just preterm delivery is not an option at this point, and it usually happens right around the time of implantation. Usually 50 to maybe as many as 75% of babies who are lost because of miscarriage happen that early, which means that a lot of pregnancies are lost before mama even knows she's pregnant. And that might explain some things in your past as you think back and think, I kind of thought I was pregnant and something wasn't quite right. Could have been that. Oftentimes, these happen because of some sort of genetic abnormality, chromosomal abnormality, something didn't develop correctly, and basically the baby just can't survive, and the body takes care of it. Usually, these pass on their own, especially these early ones. Usually, they'll pass on their own from the uterus, and you might never even know you're pregnant, like I mentioned. That is known as, by the way, if the baby completely passes out of your uterus and nothing ever had to be done for it, it's called a complete miscarriage. That means that all of the products of conception, meaning the baby, the placenta, if there was one, membranes, anything that was in there to help sustain that pregnancy, it all comes out on its own. Okay. A missed miscarriage is one that happens where your baby passes away, but either you didn't know it or you found out much later and it doesn't come out on its own. So you find out not because you saw evidence, but because you find out maybe you go to prenatal appointment and there's just no heart rate, something like that. Also, some mamas will notice that maybe they don't feel pregnant anymore. They don't have pregnancy symptoms anymore all of a sudden, way sooner than they expected. They may have bleeding, they may have cramping. When you have bleeding and cramping together, those are known into the medical world. And I'm going to use the term that they use because it's an ugly term, but I want you to understand this so that if you hear it sitting in a doctor's office, you're not shocked. It's known as a threatened abortion because the medical world sees any loss of a pregnancy, whether it's intentional or not, as the word abortion. But you can also call it a threatened miscarriage. That's a much better term. I just want you to be aware that that is a term that you might hear used. So if you have the decrease in pregnancy symptoms, plus you have bleeding, plus you have cramping, usually bleeding by itself can be okay, but bleeding and cramping together, these are ominous signs, and usually it means that if you haven't already lost your baby, you're probably losing your baby. Bleeding, though, oftentimes doesn't happen till as much as 2 weeks after the baby stopped growing. So usually by the time you're seeing those kinds of signs, it's already done, and it has been for a while. So if you find out that you've either lost your baby or you think you may have lost your baby, the first thing that most practices are going to want to do is an ultrasound. And that's because that's really the best diagnostic tool that we have now. And it's a viable option for sure. It's not a bad option, but I just want you to remember that ultrasound isn't perfect. I have known of people who thought they lost their baby by ultrasound and they waited, and it turned out their baby continued developing and they delivered them to term. So I don't say that to give you false hope. It might come across that way, but the reason I say that is it is not 100%. There is false positives, false negatives that can happen. So just keep that in mind that it's not perfect. It can be wrong. Also remember, it's not without harm. Go back to episode 128 and listen to that, knowing that again, this is the best tool they have, but it's not just a cut and dry decision. If your baby is still alive in there, it could be harmful to it. Remember that book I told you you should get and read. I'll talk about that back in episode 128. Get that before you get to the point that you have to make these decisions, just so you have all the information. But just realize that given all that, there's really not much other way to find out what's going in there right now than an ultrasound. So it's a decision that you have to make. There are some labs you can do that you look at over time that will give you the information that you need, but it's just a slower process. And a lot of times doctors just want to know right now. You may want to know right now. And so ultrasound is the quickest way to know what's going on inside. Either way, no matter what you decide, this is a very tough time. And that's really the point of this episode. When things are hard, when it's hard to know what to do, I don't want you to have to rush. I don't understand why in the medical field we have to rush moms to make a decision. This is an impossible time for a mom to think through things well because she's just hurting too bad. So I want to go through the options with you if you have miscarried your baby so that you can know what's available and make a decision. In this time of extreme emotion, it is so important for you to breathe and to think it through so that you can grieve and you can start the healing process, which may seem impossible to you right now. Some women think they can just get it over with. They just want it over. Let's just get this done. I don't even want to think about it anymore. And some are able to do that for a time. But just know that if you don't deal with this, it's going to come back to you at some point. It's really a better option and a healthier option for you to walk through the steps of grief and walk through the steps of healing now so that you can move on in a healthy way, no matter how early you are, even if you're only, a few weeks pregnant. It's still a loss. If you're, 18 or 20 weeks pregnant, it's even harder loss. But I don't want you to just rush through it and skip over it. So there's three different approaches. Well, there's more than that, but for early miscarriages, there's usually three different approaches. First, you have the wait and see approach. This is usually most recommended for moms who are less than about 12 weeks. Out of those moms who choose this option, only about 20% ended up needing surgery, because when you start the wait and see approach, there's always the possibility it could end up progressing to one of the other ones if signs develop that it's needed. There's really no evidence out there to support whether the wait and see approach predisposes you to more or less infection. So it's really hard to say about that. It does seem that the wait and see approach has fewer complications. Couldn't think of the word. Fewer complications. There doesn't seem to be any impact on future fertility with the wait and see approach, and women seem to prefer this oftentimes. But it may take days or weeks for your baby to completely pass out of your uterus. And that's hard. In addition, while this is going on, you're going to be watching for signs and symptoms of infection. And if they develop, then the plan's going to change and something's going to need to happen to get the baby out so that you don't get sick. So the next option is called a medical evacuation. It's just a rough term, but basically it means that we use medicines to help your baby to come out. The medicines are either prostaglandins or antiprogesterones. Prostaglandins basically cause your uterus to contract and push the baby out. Antiprogesterones kind of end up doing the same more or less, but they're working against the progesterone level that your body developed to try to maintain the pregnancy. They're the same medications that are used for people who are choosing to have an abortion, and that can be hard for some moms to think about. There is mixed evidence about them. Some people may end up needing surgery anyway, even if they try the medical option, especially if bleeding continues after it should have been stopped. It's usually seen as less expensive than the surgical option, but at this time, usually people aren't all that concerned with expense. They're just trying to walk through this in a way that doesn't traumatize them too bad. The third option is surgical removal. There's two different types of surgical removal. One is usually earlier on. It's called a dilation and curettage. That means that basically they open up the cervix, sometimes also using the medication that I mentioned before. They'll open the cervix and then they'll go in and kind of scrape the lining of the uterus to just take everything out. It takes like 10 or 15 minutes. Then there's also dilation and evacuation, and it's called D&E. That's usually in the second trimester or later. And it might also involve using suction. It usually takes about 30 minutes, but it's accomplishing the same goal, which is to get the products of conception, the baby, the placenta, the membranes, all the different things that are in there, to get them out so that you don't develop an infection. So those are the three main ones for early on in pregnancy. If you're further along, if you're second trimester or later, you're probably going to have to go through the labor process, and that is nearly impossible mentally. Because you're having to go through the same process as you would to give birth to a live baby, only you don't have the reward of that live baby at the end. And I have taken care of mamas for this, and it's just heart-wrenching. But it's the reality. And so if you're second trimester or later and you lose your baby, you will probably go through the labor process. You can, waiting and seeing is still an option to see if your body will go into labor. If it does not, then an induction is an option, just the same as it would be for a live pregnancy. You get the medications, you urge your body to get into labor, and then the baby eventually comes out. It's really not all that much different than a regular vaginal birth, except for obviously the emotional trauma and the fact that the baby's not alive at the end. If for some reason the induction doesn't work, if for some reason the vaginal birth isn't progressing as you need it to, if anything goes wrong, there is always the option as well as as in a normal pregnancy of C-section. And that's just the surgical removal of the baby through an incision low in the uterus, the same as a C-section for a live baby, like I said. So these are your options. And they're all impossible if you're the one going through them. And I totally get that. But here's what I need you to do. I need you to take your time. It's almost never an emergency. You've got time to think it through. You don't have to decide today. You can ask your doctor if your doctor seems to be urging you or your midwife seems to be urging you to do it right now. You can say, what happens if I wait a day or 2 days or 5 days or a week? Can I not wait? Is there a reason that I need to hurry this up? And is my body showing signs of infection to where I know that I need to move faster? Ask them that, and that will give you a good gauge about whether or not you can take your time, because I really, if possible, want you to take your time. There is no rush. I want you to take your time to grieve. This is a real loss, even if you were never able to see your baby. And so it can be hard. You know, when an older person dies, you have a casket and you can go into the funeral home and you can spend some time working through this process. But when it's a little baby that you may not ever even see, it's so hard to walk through it. I want you to find ways to honor your baby, whether it be if your baby's big enough to where you can get any footprints, locks, pictures, anything like that. Anything you can have to remember her or him by. You may not know if it's a him or a her, by the way. Even if the baby comes out intact, sometimes if it's early enough, you won't be able to tell yet. But you can still find ways to remember and honor your baby. I want you to get the support that you need from your family or from counselors, or maybe there's Facebook groups these days that'll really help you. Sadly, I can almost guarantee you know someone else who's gone through this. And if you know who they are, reach out to them. Find someone who can help you walk through this. Don't ignore physical symptoms. If you start to feel sick, listen to your body. That can be a way that your body is telling you that you need a little help to keep you from getting sick. So if you have signs of infection, don't ignore them. Get them seen about. And don't numb the feelings. Feel them. I know they hurt, but feel them so that you can work through grieving and be able to heal with time. It's not a fast process, but you will heal with time. I'm not saying it'll ever completely stop hurting, but what I am saying is that it is possible to heal in a healthy way and move forward so that you can be okay. I hope this has helped you. I hope this has benefited you in some way. And if you are still in your childbearing years, bookmark this some kind of way, so that if you ever find yourself in these shoes, you can come back and listen again. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you back here next week.
Real quick, if today's episode blessed you in any way, would you head over to Apple Podcasts and leave me a quick 5-star written review? It'll take you less than a minute, but it's the best thank you can give me, and it will help my show to reach more mamas just like you, so we can all find God's best for our families. I'll see you right back here in a few days.